So I'm gonna get started, but thank you for all of you who found your way here, and hopefully you're here to hear me speak about community-directed consultation and collaborative research, and how they're critical to achieving FPIC. If you wanted to be in a different session, you're welcome to go find that session. For everyone else, thanks for navigating the maze to find your way down here. So I'm going to do a lot of, I think, sort of sitting down and getting up. I've got my laptop down there, so I'm going to sort of jump around a little bit as I do this presentation. I wanted to start by expressing my gratitude. It's a great honor to be the guest of the Towagh Ojibwa Nation on their beautiful territory today. I have come from Victoria, British Columbia to participate in this and hear what everyone else has to say about FPIC and to present on some of the work that I've been doing over the past 15 years. My work has been primarily conducting what are called traditional land use or traditional use studies, sometimes called use and occupancy mapping, doing community engaged and directed research and capacity building, as well as building tools, software tools to support this type of research. I've had the honor to work with over 30 First Nations in Western and Northern Canada. My perspective on this is on the challenges that First Nations face and the way in which practitioners, consultants, researchers, and community members who do this type of work, the way in which this, I think, should happen is very much based on a large number of First Nations community members and elders who were willing to spend a long time talking to me. I've done, I think, 200 or 300 interviews with community members, and it's really the way that they've shared their knowledge and understanding of their communities and their territories and the challenges that they face that informs the research methodology and the software tools that I'm going to be talking about today. Currently, these are the communities that we work with. I lead a small research and software development company in Victoria, BC. We have the great honor to work with many of the First Nations and Métis communities in the Athabasca Delta and the lower Athabasca, in the oil sands area, a number of First Nations around British Columbia. We have a very close relationship working over the last, especially 5 years, with the Upper Nicola Band, who are in the interior of BC, and also the Adams Lake Band, a little to the north of them in the interior of British Columbia. Welcome. Before these additional folks just came in, I was talking about how hard it is to find this room and the maze. So congratulations on finding us. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking specifically about UNDRIP and FPIC. You know, if you're here, I'm sure you're familiar with that free and informed consent prior about what FPIC, well, means different things to different people, but essentially what I'll be talking about today is how the processes that I work in with communities are very much about consultation and environmental assessment processes. and especially looking at FPIC and the need for information. And so it's really the information component of FPIC that I'll be talking about a lot over the next 40 or so minutes, and hopefully saving some time for questions at the end. So Indigenous communities need the right information that is accurate, that's detailed, that's provided in a timely way, and in a format that is understandable or that lends itself to assessment. This is great. I thought I was going to be presenting to about 3 people. There's some really good concurrent sessions, so I'm kind of surprised, and it's a great honor that this many people would come to this session. I think there's what's the cord, but yeah, there's a few chairs left. Great.
Take them all and
Yeah, okay. So the research that I've been doing supporting First Nations is very much at the interface of what's happening with federal and provincial regulatory processes, especially environmental assessment processes, consultation, and always under all of it, it's being informed by developments in jurisprudence. The Supreme Court decisions on consultation that inform what Indigenous rights or Aboriginal and treaty rights are and how they're being defined is always there sort of in the background, informing the way that we have to do our work and the way that things should be done. And of course, you know, this is an evolving area which is changing, and FPIC, as was presented in the keynote this morning, is really something that is only being adopted in Canada somewhat now. There's a lot of good sort of talk. I don't know how much action we're seeing yet, but the work that I'm talking about is very much at the confluence of all of these sort of forces around consultation, environmental assessment, and the jurisprudence. The federal government has said that they endorse FPIC. We don't really know at this point what that means. I guess it's sort of, you know, it's a conversation that is proceeding at the moment. Likewise, I'm from the province of British Columbia, and the NDP BC government has taken a similar step, which is a fairly recent change in government policy, that they have said that they are also adopting FPIC. And I think in British Columbia, although in some ways British Columbia sort of leads the country in there being a understanding of some of the case law and the need for consultation with Indigenous communities in the province, the adoption of FPIC is really something that is new and yet to be determined how that's really going to happen and what it really means in a concrete way. I'm sure many of you know a number of the court decisions. Certainly Haida Taku and Mikisew Cree, who have the honor of doing a fair amount of work with, having won court decisions that define the need for consultation. And then you know, additional decisions by the courts that have further clarified what is meant by Aboriginal and treaty rights and the need for consultation. What's of particular importance in the HIDA decision is this quote: "The scope of the duty to consult is proportionate to a preliminary assessment of the strength of the case supporting the existence of the right or title and to the seriousness of the potentially adverse effect upon the right or title claimed." So what they're saying in the court decision here is that there needs to be a different depth of consultation based on not only the right, which could potentially be impacted, but how severe that impact will be. Is it going to be an adverse impact? To what degree might that right be impacted? And so that's a very important thing to think about in the work that we do, and as I go through this talk, because what's happening is there needs to be some judgment, some kind of an assessment. If there's a proposed industrial development, is there a right that's being affected, and to what degree? And then the level of consultation, the depth of consultation, and also the level of accommodation or the type of accommodation is directly proportionate to the assessment of, in a way, how severe or adverse that effect is. And so the way that typically that is understood is that it's the environmental assessment process that provides guidance on how adverse, how significant is the effect on the Aboriginal or treaty right that is being claimed. Which gets us to the point of, who is making that determination? How is it being made? Does this process work? So, as a part of many environmental assessments, certainly not all, probably more so in Western Canada than in Central and Eastern Canada, environmental assessment includes what can be variously use studies, traditional land use studies, or use and occupancy mapping. All of them refer to a similar way of going about a research project where community members are interviewed, mapping is conducted, sometimes life histories with mapping, sometimes a lot of oral history with a bit of mapping, sometimes focused very much just on mapping in a small area. There's quite a difference in the way that people go about these, but it is generally understood that the baseline or the research that is needed to understand the effects on certain rights of an Indigenous community can be addressed through one of these studies. That this is one of the ways to identify what those rights are and eventually to look at what the severity or significance of those impacts are. So they can form an important part of an environmental assessment and, as I said earlier, a part of the understanding of the depth of consultation that is required, as well as the level of accommodation that may be required. The problem is that this has not gone well. So, and here I'm talking not about traditional land use studies specifically, but I'm talking about the whole environmental assessment process. So this quote is from the expert panel for the review of environmental assessment processes. It came out 2017. This was this big consultation that the Liberal government held over, what is the state of the environmental assessment process, what's happening with SIA in the country. And so I think this is a fairly accurate summary of the sentiments of the majority of First Nations who I've worked with, that they have a lack of confidence in the assessment decisions. They're based on flawed planning, misinformation, mischaracterization of Indigenous knowledge or Aboriginal treaty rights, and are opaque decision making. So this is a major problem in that this is the process that is supposed to, in a sense, inform how much is actually done to consult First Nations and accommodate the impacts on First Nations. This is actually a couple of years ago. We wanted to, before the review was done federally, we just wanted to have kind of an indication of, we've been hearing a lot from First Nations about how poor the environmental assessment process was for them. We got a graduate student to look at the outcomes and read through environmental assessments. So from the years 2000 to 2016, we had this grad student review all of the environmental assessment applications for British Columbia and Alberta, and those in those provinces that were jointly done with the federal government under SIA. And so there were almost 200 environmental assessment applications that were reviewed. And what we were looking for was, okay, if they're going to make an assessment or come to some kind of understanding about the impacts to First Nations, it would follow from that that there should be some kind of baseline that they're working from. They should have some kind of research in that assessment that they can make some kind of, so that they can make an assessment. It's, yes?
Well, you had talked about in the slide before the lack of confidence. What do you see as being that, contributing to that lack of confidence? Is it the baselines, or?
There's multiple factors. I think, you know, probably there's quite a bit of knowledge in this room about lack of confidence. I mean, it's quite often that the process is, one of the major things that people see is the process has started too late. First Nations, they're coming to First Nations after they've already designed a project. And so it's not really, at that point, you're not getting a lot of engagement on, you know, are there even ways to change this project so that the impacts are not as great? Well, if they've already had all their engineering work done and they're moving ahead with a plan, they're not often very willing to change that plan if they've already put, I don't know, you know, a couple $1 million into getting to that point. So not engaging early enough, not providing information that is really adequate in the way that it's provided, such as it's not uncommon for First Nations to get banker boxes full of technical documents delivered to their offices. Well, that's fine if you have a team of people with the training to review those documents, but the technical review of an environmental impact assessment that might be 3,000 pages of technical writing, my experience, not what our company does, is that that's a $60,000 review process to go through, just to review the documents, not even engaging the community about it. If a proponent or the government is stepping up and not offering the time and the money to do that, how can you be confident in this process? Yes?
But isn't it, the decision on Kinder Morgan was basically that the corporation, they had a duty to consult and they didn't. So that's the benchmark right there for projects.
Absolutely. And I feel like we're getting a little bit ahead. In fact, the conclusion of my talk, you've just about so, if you let me continue, I'd like to still have some kind of punchline at the end of it. But that's very, very true. So back to this slide, and I'll try and get through this so we can have a bit more discussion at the end. So our questions were, was there a baseline study, a traditional land use study or something similar that was collecting information on the rights of the Indigenous communities? You know, sort of yes or no on that. And then, was there a assessment of the significance of the potential impacts of the project on those rights? So those were the two questions that we had this poor grad student read almost 200 of these. And this is, I'm gonna move on quickly. I am around the conference and glad to discuss details of this with anyone who wants to get into it a little bit more, but essentially what we saw was that of the, I think it's 198 that were reviewed, 102 of them actually had no baseline study. There was actually nothing there to assess impacts against. 94 of them did have some kind of traditional land use study. Sorry, I said 198, I guess we're at 196 on this part. Effects were determined to not be significant on 100, so essentially 51% of the projects, the outcome of the environmental assessment when it came to Indigenous peoples was that they said it will not be significant. There were 8 of them where they said there would be significant effects, and there were 88 of them where there was no determination of significance at all. There was no assessment on the impacts of the project to Indigenous peoples. I know that every single one of these projects was proceeding on Indigenous traditional territory. There are not any places that aren't Indigenous traditional territory in BC and Alberta.
What kind of projects were they? Like,
Yeah,
say that-
so,
yeah.
so that's an important point, because, you know, you might go, well, half of them they determined effects not to be significant, and a bunch of them they didn't do any determination, only 8 where they found significance. These were all major industrial developments. So for them to go through the British Columbia Environmental Assessment Office, or, sorry, in Alberta it's changed names a couple times, but they're their regulator in Alberta, and to go through SIA or the National Energy Board process, they have to be large-scale industrial development. So these are mining projects, these are long electrical transmission lines, hundreds of kilometers, pipelines that are hundreds of kilometers. They are sometimes infrastructure projects, such as major roads or highways. They're hydroelectric dams. All of them are very large-scale projects where it is, I think when we talk about First Nations feeling like this process is not adequate and is not working for them, just based on the numbers, if what you have is 4% of 200 of these projects proceeding with saying that there are not any significant effects on Indigenous peoples, their rights, their lands, that really begs the question about the accuracy of this process. Now, keep in mind that I think it was on the last slide, I think that we only reviewed projects up to 2016. I'm sure that people in government would argue that the process has gotten better over time. A lot of these are from, you know, sort of 10, even 15 years ago. But that said, the numbers are a little startling. We had a number of other things that we found when it came to traditional land use studies. Studies are buried. Sometimes they're an appendix to an appendix without a reference to the study within the actual main part of the document. Quite often we found that the environmental assessments were submitted before the traditional land use study was completed. So obviously they're not actually informed by the study. Studies are often done, this is more of an issue of practitioners than it is the regulator and government. There's a lot of studies that are done that lack details about the methodology, how they were conducted, and, you know, things that you might use to determine how accurate they are. We saw many cases where they were taking baseline data from other sources, so you know, if a study had been done in the area 10 years earlier, they were just going to use that, and they weren't updating the information. There's sometimes a grouping in these environmental assessments of Aboriginal and treaty rights grouped together with archaeological sites, which is quite odd. Not that archaeological sites aren't important to First Nations, but an archaeological site is defined as such because of its scientific value. And it's a very different reason for an archaeological site to be valued by an archaeologist than it is by a First Nation. You take a spiritual site, for example, of a First Nation, an archaeologist is not an archaeological site unless there happens to be essentially materials left behind from ceremonial practices that were conducted there a long time before. And that's what it's valued for, is to being able to recover, you know, the materials from some practices, as opposed to a First Nation who understand it as a spiritual site. So they're quite different from each other. There was even confusion about who is supposed to make the assessment. There were times when a proponent or the consultant working for a proponent would sort of say, well, it's up to the First Nations to make this assessment, but in doing that, they're not including a First Nations assessment in their environmental assessment application. They're really saying nothing at that point. So those were a number of findings about flaws in the process. I'm going to, how am I doing on time? Yeah, I've got to move this. I need to go a lot faster. I'm going to skip over the new changes to the environmental assessment process. I mean, we don't actually know what any of this means yet, in any case. There are a number of issues with the way the Liberal government have proposed the new act. So, what I would really like to get into is the information component of FPIC. So, I'm going to be looking at both software tools and also at research methodology. So, I'm going to be talking about a software tool that I've collaboratively developed with a number of First Nations. It is a tool that is provided by our company in Victoria. As a result, I don't want to just be up here saying, everyone buy this software, which would be great, but no, really, the importance to me is that First Nations are using tools that help them to get the information that they need from proponents and government, and that they have a way of assessing the information that's coming in. And so there are a number of tools that will do that. We provide one of them. I wanted to refer everyone to, there is a review that was prepared by EcoTrust last year. It's available online. In British Columbia, all the mostly smaller scale consultation information that's coming into First Nations, they talk about as referrals from government. And so referrals management software, EcoTrust has done an independent review of 8 of the different systems that are being used by First Nations in British Columbia. So that report is available. I'm sure it has ways that you can follow up from there with the companies that provide those software solutions. The one that we've worked on for the past 8 years is called Community KnowledgeKeeper, or CKK. And basically, what happened is when was it? It was 2008. I was working with the Fort Nelson First Nation in northeastern British Columbia. We were doing a traditional use study, and they said, we have a bunch of data. And it looked like this. It was in a filing cabinet. They had some paper maps as well. They had some transparencies. They had 2 or 3 different GIS databases that were legacy from different periods over the last 10 years. This is very difficult data to access. It's great that they have it, and other communities who have data like this is also great that they have it. These photos were actually just taken a couple of weeks ago in our office. The Mikisew Cree just decided to ship us 6 banker boxes full of stuff like this. And they said, oh, you know what, we haven't gotten to this in the last 10 years, can you just digitize it all for us? So we've started out doing that. So in 2008, it was very difficult to bring together all the different kinds of recorded media that the First Nation had. At the same time, for the Fort Nelson First Nation, there was a natural gas boom, fracking for natural gas in their traditional territory, which meant that they were getting over 300 referrals a year. Referrals were coming on, there's a lot of, one of the problems with environmental assessment is project splitting. So they were getting one application that would be on 6 wellheads, a different one that would be on a short pipeline that would go to those wellheads, another one for the camp where the workers were going to stay who were going to work on that, another one for the access road that goes there. And so they'd get these information packages, they'd be shipped by Canada Post, they'd have 2 weeks to respond. It took Canada Post 10 days to get the paper package to them, so now they have 4 days left. They open up the package and what they see is a paper map, nice looking map, big printed paper map of muskeg though, with boxes in it where the wellheads would go. If you look at a map of muskeg, it's a bunch of ponds that change shape depending on the time of the year. And so there's no way to actually identify easily from a map like that where in the territory they're talking about. So they're getting inundated with all of these paper packages on one side, and then they know that they might have information on cassette tapes of someone talking about sites that could be impacted, but there's the length of time it would take to take those paper maps, sort out where they're talking about, go back to tapes and listen to them. You can imagine that's a very laborious process. So we came up with a piece of software that would digitize, would keep everything in context, so you could pull in all of the data from research, and then you could query it against the information coming from government. I'm going to, hopefully this works. So this is a view of a demonstration site we have of the software. Let's see how I'm doing. Okay.
Indian time, you're good.
All right, thanks. So basically, what you're seeing here is a screen of is a website where in the oil sands, all 8 of the Indigenous communities have a version of this setup with their own database, their own user accounts. They control who has access to it. There's a very limited permission that's given to, in Alberta, it's industry who consults directly rather than the government. In British Columbia, it's the government who consults. So what they do in Alberta is they provide industry, the folks who do Indigenous consultation, with access to an account in their CKK. They fill out a simple form going, here's the details of the development that we're proposing. They attach a GIS shapefile, a map file to it, and they hit submit. They're quite happy to do this because that process takes them, I mean, it depends how hard it is for them to get their materials together, but this is a 5 to 15 minute submission. And then they get an email back from the CKK that says, the Fort McKay First Nation has received your consultation on this. Our anticipated response date is this date. And they have a PDF attached of the submission that they made. So for their consultation record, they have a very clear piece of information on the record. For the First Nation, the person who's responsible on staff gets an email, and they click on that email and they open the page that we're going to see here. And you can see that essentially you've got your basic information about a industrial development, you've got the company, you've got the contact here, Bork Mendelsohn at the company, and down on the map here, the red polygon, or looks kind of orange from here now, is the project footprint. And now what the CKK does is on the, when that spatial information is submitted, it runs queries on all of the spatial information that is in the CKK. So that person who works for the Fort McKay First Nation, for example, will immediately see, okay, this project that's being proposed is within our reserves. We can also see that it's within federal caribou zones, and it's within an area that we identified for protection. In addition, there are 21 traditional use sites. If we click on this, you'd see details on what those sites are that are intersecting with this project. There's 7 more within 1 kilometer, 2 more within 2 kilometer. There's also 5 intersecting archaeological sites. So this is all dependent on, obviously, like what happens with, you know, it takes some work for the First Nation to get their information in here, but the idea is to create a centralized database controlled by the First Nation where they are able to hold all of their information and have it automatically queried when industry and government provides information that they're being consulted on a particular project. What happens from here, I won't go into. When we do a software demonstration, it usually takes about an hour to go through all of the details of how this works. We build customized workflow processes where you can identify which kinds of reviews you want to have done. You can have templated response letters put in there, so if you're going to be objecting to a project and it's a mining project, there's a templated letter in there for that. If it's a archaeological permit, which is something in British Columbia communities are consulted on, there's a different kind of templated response letter for a response to an archaeological permit. So you get to the end after the reviews, the comments that people have made on the reviews of impacts are inserted automatically into a templated response letter. You can edit that letter. You click the button to save and send. It makes a PDF of the letter, and it sends it back to the proponent and back to the regulatory agency. So a process that for a First Nation that's getting hundreds of these small referrals in a year, now they can go through this and it can streamline it so it's much faster. And the main purpose of this isn't that everything gets out the door fast, it's that you're catching the ones that have a lot of impacts. This is a project that has a lot of impacts. Other ones you can imagine might be sort of on the periphery of your territory, or maybe in an area that's already highly industrialized. Maybe you don't even respond to that. Maybe you get the template response letter out in 5 minutes and you're done with it. But this allows you to focus on those projects where you really need to have deep consultation. You really need to bring some expertise and research to bear on what the effects are going to be. This can be configured for environmental assessment processes that go on for years, and it can be configured for very simple ones where it's a cell phone tower going into the town, you know, and it's not something you want to spend a lot of time on. So that is the basics of what happens with the consultation side of the software. We have a side of the software that is the place to hold lots of research data, document projects. I'm going to show you a demonstration of this is for a traditional land use study. You can put information on what the study is, attach a final report. The map on the side shows all of the mapping that was done, as well as a project footprint if it's being done in relation to an environmental assessment, and a study area. What it does, which, you know, it's not so surprising the way technology has gone, but when we first came out with this, you know, 8 years ago, it was very exciting to be able to manage your data, so you could attach audio files, video, notes, transcriptions, spatial data, and have a page for every single interview, where in this case, this is a interview with Leona. She has a community, she has a profile page that's just about this community member. Your research team you've got your mapping that's happened here. Each of these map sites has a link that will take you to a page with more information about that site. They're also listed down here. There's a place name, and attached this is a video of the interview. We recommend doing a close-up shot that's good for transcribing, and then also doing one where you can see everything that's happening in the room, and you can see the screen where the mapping is actually happening.
Is the data accessible to other people? Like, is there, the information that you have, recorded transcriptions, whatever it is it available for anybody to access?
It's controlled by the First Nation, where they decide who has user accounts, who can access it. Usually it's only their staff members. Sometimes they give chief and council a read permission, so they can view it, but they can't edit anything. But there are a number of different types of user accounts that can be granted, from industry, who can only submit information about development, through to admin level controls, research assistants that can just see a piece of it. There's a number of different user accounts, but it's one CKK per First Nation, and they control who has access to the information.
So the information that you would have, you're identifying traditional lands, and you're identifying, say, sites. That's from your point of view, from the First Nations point of view. Is that acceptable with the government? Is there any hesitation to accept any of those boundaries? To say that your traditional land boundary location is wrong according to our information? And is there any kind of difficulty in that? Or is it acceptable?
I find that either, I mean, in a very general sense, I do want to get into a specific project that I'll talk more about, which relates a little to this, but I find that either it's accepted or it's ignored. We don't find that there's a lot of sort of government disputing the information. They do sometimes ignore it altogether, but usually when it's presented, they're accepting, and especially if what you're talking about is a territorial boundary or a consultation boundary, I mean, they're not really in a position to deny that.
Well, the perfect example would be if your pipeline was going to go across a corner of your territory, and if they've been ignoring the information that your data has about where the boundary line might be, and ignorance, you're going to say, well, why should we bother consulting with you? Because we don't really believe your boundary is in that location, and we're going through that other area.
Yeah. I mean, it really, I think depends on the specifics of the situation. I mean, I think there's a number of strategies, but again, this is a situation where I think it's more common for them to ignore than it is for them to dispute it and go, because the government does not have better information on a First Nation's rights and land use than the First Nation has. And I think at some level they'll recognize that that's the case, and if you're making a claim, and in fact in Haida, it was about the Supreme Court case with Haida, it was about an asserted right, not a proven right. And the duty to consult is triggered with an asserted right. It doesn't have to be a proven right. So I understand that that may not always be reflected in the way that industry is dealing with your First Nation, but they're wrong. That's the Supreme Court has spoken on this. And I'd like to, I'm going to run out of time, so, but I would be glad to talk more about this. I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint here. I hope.
Way back.
that's enough about software. Yeah, so, you know, it's useful for, really the information part of FPIC. I think whether it's our software or whether it's some other company's software or some way of sort of piecing together the use of some free software between Google Earth and some spreadsheets and things, there are ways that, you know, people can achieve
How many
this.
other software programs are out there that you know of?
Well, the list that I showed the review, there's 8 including ours.
Oh, okay.
They don't all have the same features. Some of those don't have any mapping features. Some of them don't do the response letters.
Yeah.
Some of them are focused more on apps for collecting data. Some of them are focused on kind of just managing the files around the consultation record, and they don't really work at assessment. There's a whole range of
Yours just kind
things.
of touches on all of that, though.
It does, yeah. And I welcome you to read the report from EcoTrust and because they do get into the features of the different software products.
Where is all the information housed? Like I guess it's off-site in the reserve, so.
Yeah, it's actually the funny thing is our data is all housed in Ontario because there's some really good secure facilities out here that have, you know, our under lock and key, have backup generators, have a high level of security, and so we have a dedicated server in a data center in southern Ontario. It's being backed up to a second data center in Ontario. So we have nightly, weekly, and monthly backups that are kept in 3 locations of this. In addition, there is one of the First Nations. There are 32 communities who use CKK. One of them has been hosting it on their own server locally, so it is a possibility, although it's been a bit of a technical challenge. It's certainly easier for us to host all of it, but it depends what people are comfortable with.
So is there a minimum requirement of hardware you need for the First Nation, like a GIS system? Obviously.
Actually, I would recommend that in most cases, with software like ours, First Nation doesn't need to have GIS. If you have a lot of things that you really need, such as making your own maps and printing them in very large format, our software doesn't do that. If you're doing complex modeling, where you're, you know, I know that in archaeology they do potential modeling, for example, where they'll run a model with distances to bodies of water and all these different factors, and they do modeling. Our software does not do modeling, it does not print large maps. Those are things you need GIS for, but if that's something that you don't need lots and lots of, this is much more affordable, and you can get reviewable maps that you can easily assess some of these impacts. And one of the main benefits is that when we do a training in our software, that's a 1-day training. If you want to learn to do GIS, I mean, those tend to be a 6-month program or something. So this is something that you can have quite a number of your staff trained in how to use. It's easy to use. GIS does a lot more things, but it's a lot more complicated and it is more expensive. Yes?
Just have a quick question. If you're housing the information in Ontario, and you're subject to the privacy legislation of Ontario, how do you protect the collective identity of the nation? And if you're trying to, is every nation engaged in a strict data sharing agreement where protection of their community identity is understood?
This is a conversation I'd like to, I don't think there's going to be a quick answer to that, but it's something I'd be really glad to talk to you about. We have a confidentiality agreement, contracts with the First Nations who have these systems. I'd like to talk more about the Ontario legislation. One of the reasons why we have it hosted here as opposed to in the United States, which is cheaper, is because of the Patriot Act. I'd be glad to talk with you more.
I'd be a little more comfortable if it was in Alberta, because at least they have a harm clause that recognizes the government-to-government relationship.
Okay.
Yeah, protects the collective identity.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Regarding your comment that you stated in terms of GIS, and if it was necessary for First Nations to have a GIS specialist, one thing that I realized especially for the work that I do, because I'm from the Northwest Territories and we have a really robust regulatory system, more robust than it is in the provinces. With that, I've noticed that the work that I do, I work for the Land and Environment Department, is that without a GIS person, that's how you lose lands to development. And so I always think that for any First Nation, it's very important for a First Nation to have a GIS person and not having to rely on outside entities to do your mapping work, because you need to take your shapefiles and put it into your system without having to rely on the system support people to do that, because there's always fees associated with that. So that's just one comment I want to make for First Nations here. It's very important for First Nations to have their GIS people in-house so you don't lose land, because you lose lands to development if you don't have it.
Okay. In that sense, the CKK is a GIS system.
Oh, I realize that. I use Trailmark to map our TK and to house all of our TK.
Right.
But there's always fees associated with having to use their support people to do all of that work, and it's best if it's done in-house.
How contingent is your work, software on connectivity?
On internet
Yeah.
connectivity, it's very dependent. Yeah, it is.
So there's limitations to some communities having opportunities to access?
If they don't have an internet connection at all, yeah, I don't know how we would get around that. It is a web-based system. I mean, the majority of band offices in the country do have connections, even if they're slow. We also have an app that we offer that's used for community-based monitoring, which can be used completely offline. But when it comes to the CKK, what I was showing, you do need an internet connection for that. Yeah. I mean, you could run it on a local server. It's starting to get really complicated. It's not impossible. You could do it if there was really a need.
With respect to the software, also, do you offer one-time purchase, perpetual license? What is it? Every year you subscribe? What happens to the data if you don't subscribe to the next year? What happens to your system?
It is a subscription. Communities have the ability to export their data out of it at any point. That's available all the time at no charge. So if a First Nation knew that they were not going to continue, they should export all of their data and put it into something else. I have yet to, the only times I've turned off a CKK has been when I've been instructed to do so, not for failure to pay. That doesn't mean that we'll necessarily take on, you know, tons of CKKs that we'll maintain for free, but there are some, the Wapayton Dakota Nation in Saskatchewan, they just have very small budgets. They couldn't afford to continue. We've continued to host their CKK for them at no cost.
Well, how much is the licensing?
It depends. Between $7,500 and $20,000 a year, depending on a whole bunch of factors.
Trailmark has a smaller fee than that as well too, so, and they don't charge us as a First Nation for that, because they do a lot of work for us. And so as part of that, those fees are let go of for us. So Trailmark is another entity that does mapping software as well.
Yeah, Trailmark's in the list of.
But at that time when we did that report, they were just getting started, so in terms of the interview questions that were guided for them in developing that report, I think it was a little bit late.
Okay, okay.
Just one last question about the licensing. So is that per computer, or is
No,
it
no,
a
that's
community?
unlimited number of users, as many accounts as you want to give, as many projects, as many consultations. There's no limitation, and so far there's no limitation on the amount of data that can be stored as well. Some communities have hundreds of hours of video.
Yes.
We haven't hit a limit where we need to charge for it yet. There is a whole other part of the presentation, and we're almost out of time here. I did want to talk a little bit about, I was talking about how we were doing a traditional use study with the Fort Nelson First Nation. When we were developing this software, we go through a process with communities where the first thing, well, usually, just as a bit of background, these are funded by proponents. Usually proponents in environmental assessments contact a First Nation and say, we would like you to participate in our environmental assessment. Where that's a First Nation where we have a relationship of trust with them, they know us, they come to us and say, we'd like to have a budget for doing a study together. We work with them to develop a budget and a work plan. They take that back to the proponent and hopefully get it funded. That's how most of these projects proceed. And then we come into the community. The First Nation will hire 2 community members as researchers. We spend a week with them doing a research methods training course. We go through direct to digital mapping with Google Earth, operation of video cameras, a interview guide, and then we set up a CKK with them where they can take all of the information that they're gathering in the interviews and put it into the CKK at the end of each interview. The second week, we have one of our staff go with the research team of 2 with the community members and do a week of interviewing. They start out with our staff member leading the interview. By the end of the week, the mentorship has moved forward to where the community members are leading the interview. The weeks after that, the community members do the interviewing on their own, the community researchers. It's great for the level of trust with knowing that it's community members interviewing the elders and knowledgeable members of their community. But what happens is they're uploading the data to the CKK at the end of each interview. From Victoria, we're able to continue to review their interview notes, their mapping, all of the data that they record, and to give them feedback. So we often have daily or bi-weekly phone calls with the researchers and talk through what we're seeing come out in their interviews and if there's any improvements that they need to make along the way. After that's done, we spend a while analyzing the data. We go, community members in most cases do all of the transcribing of the interviews. We then have a workshop back in the community where we bring all of that data back. All the community members involved, or sometimes open to the whole community, will review all of the information that's been recorded, and we talk through what's going to be in the report. One of the really critical parts of this that not all, and part of this I'm just saying so that if you've got other consultants out there working with you, have them step their game up if they're not doing all of this. One of the things that we do is, you can imagine if you spend 2 hours with an elder with them talking about all the important places on the land, and then on the map you bring up, here's the route where a pipeline would go through the middle of that, and then you ask them, what are the potential impacts of that? They have some very good information available. They can really think through what those impacts are likely to be. They have a depth of understanding of ecosystems and plant and animal life. Their Indigenous knowledge is really brought to bear on this. And so in addition to mapping the kind of baseline of like what's out there before development, we also do work on, you know, what would the impacts be of a proposed development. We go back, we workshop that with the community. We produce a draft report that then goes back to the community, usually either reviewed by their staff or by legal counsel, sometimes by chief and counsel. When everyone feels like that's to the point that they're happy with it, that is then sent by the First Nation to the proponent and to the regulator. So that's the basic process, here's some slides that explain that.
Are you sharing the presentation?
There's actually this slide I would have to check on whether I'm able to share this. I mean, I guess there's a video being made of it right now. It is a somewhat public report. This is a report that came out of one of these projects with the Upper Nicola Band. Like I was saying, what we do is we summarize in the report and back it up with pages of where there are quotes from community members talking about the impacts of what would happen. In this case, it's a pipeline plus an electrical transmission line to feed one of the pumping stations that's close to their community. And here's a list of 9 of the effects of their main concerns with this project. So this was submitted to the National Energy Board, and then we jump forward to just in the last few months, the court case, which is referred to as Tsleil-Waututh Nation versus Canada. The decision just recently came out. There were actually not just Tsleil-Waututh, but 6 First Nations that were part of a coalition who fought this case. Upper Nicola was one of the 6, and the findings of the court were that in this case, boy, that's a lot of text. So basically, Upper Nicola provided this report, and all the government said was that they revised project impacts upwards, but they didn't say how, and they still said project impacts were moderate. And what happened was that the NEB did not specifically respond to, sorry, it is still that slide. The NEB did not specifically respond to those 9 issues that were raised by Upper Nicola. And the court found that that was not adequate consultation. And I'm sure you've all heard the news stories about how the Trans Mountain pipeline is now on hold because of this court case. Well, part of that was the direct outcome of working with the community through a research project to identify community concerns, laying those out very clearly, providing them to the regulator, and then there not being an adequate response, which is something that, you know, they're going to really, that earlier part of the discussion about the environmental assessment process, if First Nations, if you can get your side together, where you've identified what your rights are, how they're impacted, what your concerns are, and you can put them on the public record, doesn't mean it always stops or changes a project, but at least the courts say there has to be recognition of that, there has to be accommodation. The government needs to, the Crown, it's the honor of the Crown to address those in some way. They can't just go on ignoring it, and the courts are firm on that.
The definition of consultation though is that even if they call you, that's considered consultation, regardless if you answer the phone or not. Information sharing is not deep consultation. Yeah, no.
So that is recognized in Haida. There are, and in fact the Mikisew case was all about that with the construction of a winter road, where there was information sent to Mikisew about the winter road in that case that they won, but the consultation was not meaningful. So especially where you can state that you have rights that are going to be affected, consultation needs to be deep and meaningful. And simple information sharing is not adequate consultation. I mean, the Upper Nicola Band, they got lots of information from Kinder Morgan about this project. But consultation was not adequate because when Upper Nicola responded, there was no counter from the Crown or the National Energy Board about how they were going to accommodate Upper Nicola and the rights that are being impacted by this project. So to kind of just wrap it all up, since I'm out of time, hopefully you can kind of see how all of this relates to the importance of information in FPIC. FPIC doesn't work unless First Nations have adequate information in a timely way, in a format that they can assess. And that's basically between software tools, whether it's mine or Trailmark, or one of the other companies out there that does it, or you use some free software. There's tools out there that really help, and there are ways of doing research that really pull together information in a way that it's useful, it's defensible, and it really results in there being more required from the Crown. Thank you very much for